Episode 1 of Around the World in 80 Days begins with a clock. It's a fitting image that serves as a reminder of the bet that's about to take place. It also serves as the foundation for an exciting globe-trotting adventure to ensue. Gentleman explorer Phileas Fogg is in the driving seat for this, and we begin with him receiving a letter. On the front is a picture of a clock, on the back is the word coward scribbled in taunting black ink. Fogg is not best pleased, especially when he rocks up at the Reform Club late. As he sits with the other stuffy gentlemen, all of them, bar Fogg of course, scoff at the notion of being able to travel in 80 days. This is especially prevalent when the notion of a Frenchman being responsible for the advancement of technology is brought up. As fate would have it, their butler happens to be a charismatic Frenchman by the name of Passepartout, and he accidentally spills sugar on Mr. Fortescue. Still, there's no time to dwell on that as his daughter, Abigail, comes bounding in and confronts her father. The article she wrote for the Telegraph about traveling the world is penned under a male name. As things grow heated, she's told to leave as she's scaring the other members. This article certainly piques the interest of Fogg, who has largely been quiet up to this point. As he sits with the others, he decides he's going to put this into motion from 1 p.m. this afternoon. If he can do it, Fogg will return with a £20,000 prize. And the returning date? Christmas Eve. While Abigail works hard to try and get her name printed in the Telegraph, much to her father's disdain, Passepartout winds up crossing paths with Phileas. He's just as adventurous as Fogg and has the benefit of youth too, so he's definitely up for the challenge. The journey begins and the pair are joined by Abigail, who manages to convince her father to let her serve as a journalist on this trip and track Fogg's every move. First up is a train to Dover, which we don't actually see, before hopping aboard a boat over the channel, which we do. Day 2 rolls round and the trio finally make it into Paris. Passepartout is right at home of course, given these are his people, but there is anarchy breaking out on the streets. The government has crossed the Paris Commune, and because of that, the people are out protesting in their numbers. The government are not popular here, and they've made it clear what their thoughts are about the poorest in the community. In fact, they wanted to try and pass into motion the idea that the poorest can't even vote. In an interesting little twist, it turns out that Passepartout's family are actually responsible for creating this commune, off the back of their father's wishes. Passepartout meets his brother Gerard, with Fix along for the ride and pointing out that she's a journalist and also able to speak French. As we soon learn, the commune's plan involves assassinating the president. While this is going on, Fogg finds himself in over his head, with all of his belongings taken by a bunch of kids in the street. He's also taunted by a bunch of nuns who throw shade at him and make him cough up more money. Eventually Fogg shows up at the embassy, determined to speak to the president. As he does, across the road happens to be Gerard, Passepartout, and Abigail. Abigail gains Fogg's attention and as he steps out, wham! He's hit with the bullet meant for the president. Gerard sacrifices himself as bullets rain down, shouting freedom and allowing himself to be a martyr of sorts as he dies. Out in the streets, Phileas wakes up and marvels at his luck, as the bullet in question penetrated the flask he had in his inside jacket pocket. The trio realize they need to leave Paris, reconvening outside and running from the authorities. Eventually they make their way to a hot air balloon and convince Monsieur Lhomme, who owns the balloon, to let them fly. And fly they do. As the episode closes out, the trio fly toward Italy, the next leg of their big Episode 2 of Around the World in 80 Days begins with Phileas, Abigail and Passepartout traveling by hot air balloon. Happy with their progress, the trio find their journey come to a crashing halt when Fogg accidentally crash lands and leaves them in the middle of nowhere. Phileas' self-confidence is shattered, evading Abigail's questions about what makes him fit to circumnavigate the world and trying to find a solution. Phileas is standoffish, difficult to warm to and generally not very charismatic. Thankfully Fogg does make up for some of this by managing to stop a train on the tracks and getting them all right. A beautiful bit of editing shifts this back to London briefly, as Bernard Fortescue is convinced that Abigail will be the deciding factor on whether Phileas will make it around the world or not. On the train, the trio are welcomed aboard as they learn this is bound straight for the Suez Canal. Abigail and Phileas settle in first class, meeting the other passengers, while Passepartout slums it back in third class. He immediately gains the plaudits of the other passengers though, who enjoy his company and his charisma. That night, Passepartout is haunted by the memory of his deceased brother, especially when he sees two brothers fighting with one another in the carriage. After a stern word of wisdom to them both, he heads outside to get some air and clear his head. The same charisma sadly doesn't emanate with Phileas Fogg, who's quiet as he's constantly mocked and laughed at by all those around him in first class. In fact, when they find out he's never actually traveled before, it falls to Abigail to bail him out, pointing to the assassination he managed to help stop. A lot of the drama here stems from a brash Italian named Niccolo Moretti and his imaginative son, Alberto. After breaking his model spaceship, Niccolo tries to talk to his son and apologize, but Phileas winds up getting involved. Phileas sees a bit of himself in the boy and clearly wants to try and make amends. Unfortunately, the night ends with nothing resolved and Niccolo angry, close to beating his son. The thing is, this Italian has not only questioned Phileas' integrity, but also shattered his self-confidence. What thin shreds were remaining after crash landing the hot air balloon have now almost certainly disappeared. Can you really go around the world in 80 days? However, it's the young Moretti boy who manages to inject some confidence back. He admits how proud he is of Phileas' attempts to travel around the world, and his confidence that if Phileas' father was still alive, he too would feel the same way. Just then, the train hits an unexpected obstacle, and the brakes are suddenly slammed on as the train screams to a halt. There's a precarious part of the bridge ahead, with nothing but the rail to navigate across. Phileas believes that if they uncouple the other carriages and jettison some of the coal and water, it could well be enough to lighten the load and get the train moving again. Alberto sobs, as it's revealed he hurt himself during this sudden pause on their journey. This serves as an incentive for Niccolo to relinquish control and let Phileas work with Abigail and Passepartout as they slowly cross the bridge. Time is of the essence, especially as Alberto is badly injured and needs medical attention. Abigail gives Phileas some words of encouragement, allowing them all to work together, prying off chunks of the wooden carriage to use as fuel for the engine. Eventually the train makes it to Brindisi in one piece pretty much anyway. The tattered remains of this carriage roll into the station behind the steam engine. Alberto is taken to the hospital, but just before he does, he tells Phileas Fogg that he's the right man for the job. Niccolo even warmly embraces the man too, a heartwarming moment to instill some confidence into this bumbling adventurer. As the episode closes out, our trio make their connection and find themselves bound for Egypt. However, trouble brews in the shadows, waiting to strike them as news from London reaches an unknown businessman, offering up £500 in exchange for stopping. Episode 3 of Around the World in 80 Days begins with Fogg, Abigail, and Passepartout on their way to India. As we reach day 16 of this big trip around the world, the trio hit a roadblock in the form of the captain. He's decided to take a break in Yemen. The next boat leaving is in 3 days, which would considerably set them behind schedule. Fogg, hopped up on a good dose of self-confidence, decides they should cross the desert. A stretch of land called the Empty Quarter is their destination. Only, everyone who travels there dies. Given how dangerous this route is, Fogg makes a bold decision to leave Abigail behind. As he says himself, it's way too dangerous for a woman. They don't properly say goodbye though, instead slipping a boarding pass under her door for the trip back to England. When Abigail finally awakens, she's too late. Fogg and Passepartout are already en route to Aden. Unfortunately, they're double-crossed by their guide, who leaves Passepartout and Fogg alone in the middle of the desert. With little supplies, the pair make a fire, thanks to Fogg's matches, and discuss how much they miss Abigail. Well, Abigail's search for help leads her to Jane Digby, who eventually agrees to travel across the Empty Quarter. On their way, they stumble upon Fogg and Passepartout, who aren't doing too well. It's here Abigail learns the true nature of UK journalism. The newspaper articles and stories spun about Jane Digby are all fake. She's not the bed-hopping mistress Abigail thought she was. In fact, her father tried to bed Jane originally, becoming obsessed with her. When Jane refused him, Bernard shamed her in the newspapers, turning her whole family and country against her. And the camel rider Jane left with? Well, he's actually Sheikh Medjool al-Mezrab from the great tribe of Aniza. He's never driven camels, but he is in love with Jane, and that's all that matters. It's a nice little reveal, albeit one that's perhaps obvious, especially for anyone wise to the lies spun in the UK media. That night, bandits arrive on horses and surround the group. It's difficult to see much, but after using most of their ammunition, Fogg comes up with a good plan to burn the petroleum on the floor, something foreshadowed earlier in the episode. Although they manage to slip away without incident, Passepartout is haunted, especially after killing one of the bandits during the skirmish. When the group finally make it into town, Abigail does right by Digby, writing up a scathing report against her own father, calling him a liar. With this tale done, the trio prepare to travel up to India. Only, there's a problem. It turns out Passepartout has been propositioned by a shadowy man named Needling who's working against Fogg. Passepartout is offered a lucrative trade of freedom in exchange for Fogg making sure he misses the connecting trip to Hong Kong. Will he do? Episode 4 of Around the World in 80 Days begins in India. Our trio arrive in a small village called Narapani. As we reach 28 days into this trip, Fogg, Abigail and Passepartout soon learn there's a compulsory wedding, and all guests must attend. Passepartout decides to use this to his advantage, although he's conflicted over whether to spike Fogg's drink and betray his friends or not. The seats he holds are a sleeping agent given to him by Needling last episode. For now, Passepartout decides not to, but Fogg's arrogance and demands are enough that even this reviewer may consider spiking him. The bride and groom, Arjun and Ayuda, soon stumble upon their first marital bump in the road. It's quite the obstacle too, as the army show up and arrest Arjun for deserting the Indian army. He's due to be court-martialed, and if he's found guilty, will be sent overseas to Malacca. With the wedding off, Fogg decides this is the perfect opportunity to leave. He's only interested in the bet and doesn't care about the well-being of those around him. What great traits for a protagonist to have! This selfishness is enough for Passepartout to spike Fogg's coffee after all, just as Fogg decides to talk to the general after gulping down the spiked drink of course. Instead of sleeping though, Fogg simply starts giggling and acting drunk, unable to focus. He even starts singing in the street too. While all this is going on, Ayuda sneaks into camp to find her husband-to-be. After a touching promise between the pair, she heads back into town. Just in time too, as Fogg takes a turn for the worst and starts convulsing, acting deliriously and continuing to ramble on. In confidence, Passepartout admits that he spiked Fogg's drink with seeds, but the dose he gave is way over what he should have given. The only way to save him now is to make sure Fogg stays awake. In his delirious state, Fogg sees a woman named Estella in Abigail's place. It's clear that the pair used to be together, but something caused her to leave. I'm guessing Fogg's selfishness, but his love is enough to stir Abigail and make her question what they know about this man. Abigail believes there's more to this trip than a simple wager. She deduces that Fogg is still in love with Estella and using this trip as a way of honoring her memory. Fogg awakens the next day, very much alive. Ayuda is there to greet him, agreeing to allow their guide to see them onto their train at Allahabad. However, it's time for Arjun's court-martial hearing first. Arjun gives an impassioned plea, but just before his fate is sealed, Fogg bursts in to say his piece. He too gives a speech about the symbiotic relationship between love and motivating oneself to return home from war. This is enough for Arjun to be dishonorably discharged from the army without being court-martialed. With this all resolved and the wedding still able to go ahead, the trio leave to catch their train. As they do, Bellamy receives word from Needling that Fogg has left India. However, he promises that Fogg won't make it past Hong Kong. Episode 5 of Around the World in 80 Days begins with Fogg, Passepartout, and Abigail arriving in Hong Kong. However, there's a problem. Fogg's finances have been cut off, thanks to Needling arriving with a forged letter earlier, stating he's actually a police inspector. Needling intends to arrest Fogg when he arrives, pointing out to the bank that he's a fraudster and they should be vigilant. With no money, and not many prospects, the pair need to buy their time, but that's easier said than done with Needling after them. Outside, the trio are greeted by Lady Clemency Robotham, the wife of the governor of Hong Kong. She's a big fan of Fogg's expedition and encourages the trio to meet her husband, Henry. In fact, she even encourages Fogg to show up as the guest of honor to their garden party. Before that, they rely on Passepartout's contacts in Hong Kong to find a place to stay. Deep in the heart of the city, at a place called Tai Ping Shan to be precise. Abigail squeals with delight as she finds her article in the papers. Only, she begins to doubt whether Fogg will be best pleased with some of the things she's written. Specifically the tragic romance involving Estella. Passepartout's destination in town is an old friend, Jiang Lei. He asks Jiang for a loan, just to pay for their passage through to Yokohama. He promises it'll be repaid in a few days, but there's a catch. Jiang wants Passepartout to steal a precious artifact that was originally stolen from his family, an heirloom of sorts. Jiang is well aware of Passepartout's history, including his lucrative set of skills in stealing. This artifact happens to be at the governor's house, and as he has an invitation to their garden party, it's the perfect front. Passepartout is left conflicted over what to do. The garden party goes ahead, and Abigail does her best to try and hide what she's written in the papers about Estella. When all the women approach Fogg, midway through the governor about to sign a loan for him, they encourage Fogg to join as they walk around the garden. There, they show off the white dragon necklace, which is placed around Lady Clemency's neck. Eventually the news breaks about Fogg's romantic woes and he's crushed, humiliated by Abigail's perceived betrayal. While Fogg and Abigail leave, engaged in heated conversation the whole way, Passepartout steals the white dragon necklace, which is still around Lady Clemency's neck when she's asleep. Passepartout eventually returns to Jiang with the necklace. As he hands it over, he tells Passepartout to leave Hong Kong. Of course, this move sends ripples across Hong Kong as Fogg is arrested for stealing the necklace. Passepartout is furious and scrambles to try and save Fogg's life before he's flogged for his troubles. Just before he's whipped a second time, Passepartout arrives with a note from the governor pardoning him. After the events in Hong Kong, Fogg decides to stay alone in his cabin, reading Abigail's article. They're finally out of Hong Kong and, presumably, trouble. However, he's approached by Needling, who decides that, if you need a job done right then you should do it yourself. Brandishing a gun, Fogg's life is left hanging in the balance. Episode 6 of Around the World in 80 Days begins with Fogg, Passepartout and Abigail forced into a rowing boat and exiled from their vessel. To make matters worse, a storm is closing in. As day 47 of this expedition arrives, our trio all wash up on shore, sputtering water and exhausted but very much alive. Fogg deduces that they may well be in Southeast Asia somewhere, potentially Japan. As they continue to walk along the shore, they realize they're walking in circles. This definitely isn't Japan. It's a desert island and a relatively small one at that. Passepartout luckily finds fresh water, while Abigail finds foul-tasting fruit. With a makeshift shelter, another storm rolls in. As it does, Fogg apologizes for letting them all down and bringing them to this tropical prison. Fogg blames himself for all of this, unaware that it's partly Passepartout who's to blame for this occurring. Well, Passepartout soon reveals the truth about taking money from Needling to delay the journey. Fogg is irate, and as the two fight it out, Passepartout remains determined to make things right with Fogg. The only trouble is, Fogg doesn't want to even hear him out after the betrayal. Not even the temptation of fresh lobster deters him. Abigail soon talks Fogg around though, mentioning Passepartout's brother being killed and how he shot a man in Africa. Both of these moments were footnotes in Fogg's adventure and barely acknowledged by either of them. As they talk, Abigail even points out that Passepartout's earlier suggestion that Bellamy is the puppet master behind setting Needling against him seems to hold a lot of weight. In the morning, Passepartout takes a turn for the worst. After fixing up Fogg's raft as a gesture of goodwill, he begins to shiver. He's freezing cold too, prompting Abigail to snuggle up tight and help bring his body temperature up. They even burn the shelter to try and keep the fire going. With little other choice, they decide to burn the raft, determined to help Passepartout. It works too, and as their companion gains his strength back, Fogg opens up about his past. Specifically, he talks about Estella. Fogg was originally planning a similar trip to this one in the past. He and Estella were planning to marry in Paris before traveling the world together. Only, Bellamy was against it. He continuously told Fogg he wasn't a suitable match. That poisoned doubt wormed its way into Fogg's mind, giving him cold feet as he got off the boat bound for France. He pretended that he left a case behind. As it sailed away, she sailed out of his life. After telling this story, Abigail and Passepartout finally have more knowledge of Fogg and what he's been through. It's a nice way to develop his character, and it's met by a dose of good news too. A ship passes by and sees their bonfire, rescuing the trio. Even better, this ship is bound for America, and that allows them to continue their journey as scheduled. What Episode 7 of Around the World in 80 Days starts us off in the great expanse of the American West. It's day 65 of this big trip, and Fogg and co. are in a bumpy carriage driven by 4 horses. The trio are rocking around all over the place. They're on a tight schedule, so much so in fact that they've got barely any food and resources to go on. However, they're soon stopped by a deputy marshal called Bass Reeves. He intends to take his prisoner, Ambrose, to Louisiana, where he's due to stand trial for violation of civil rights. After a tense standoff, Fogg decides to cut out through any unpleasantness and allows Bass and Colonel Ambrose to hop aboard. Ambrose has actually heard about Fogg, but specifically read about the trio drowning a week back. Passepartout soon points out, though, that it's actually safer for them to be dead, given it stops Bellamy from chasing after them. Abigail is understandably uncomfortable with this, given her father's obvious grief, while Fogg agrees to sort things out when they get back. It turns out Bellamy's interest in thwarting Fogg's journey stem from a debt he owes in London. This explains why he's so adamant to make Fogg lose. The debt collector in the street reminds Bellamy he's in deep trouble, and if he doesn't pay up, it could end up very ugly for him. So naturally Bellamy heads back in to see Bernard, urging him to pay up his side of the bet, given Fogg and the others are dead. Bellamy coldly tells his colleague to pull himself together, angsty over receiving the money, so he can pay his debts. Meanwhile, Fogg and the gang stop for a break en route to their destination, Battle Mountain. The thing is, Ambrose's cronies are in hot pursuit, intent on tracking their brethren down. As we soon find out, Ambrose is actually part of the Ku Klux Klan, and with Passepartout and Bass both black, that doesn't pose well for their prospects if Ambrose's men catch up. When they finally travel on their wagon, Bass hands over his pistol to Abigail, allowing her to hold on to it for the time being. When they make it in town, they arrive just in time, as the transcontinental train they're due to board is due in 30 minutes. Racial tensions are high in town, with Passepartout antagonized when he shows up in the bar. Fogg stands by his side though, which is certainly noble. The only trouble is, things take an awful turn when Ambrose's cronies show up in town. Even worse, the lines are cut on communications in town too. Things are about to get ugly. When they arrive at the bar, Ambrose organizes his goons to hold Bass, Passepartout, and Fogg captive. With a knife in hand and guns pointed at his head, Ambrose forces Fogg to make a choice. Specifically a choice that involves picking up a knife and cutting Passepartout's finger off. Abigail shows up with her pistol, shooting wildly around the bar, and doing enough to turn the tide of fortune for our protagonists. Bass uses his shotgun to kill 2 of the men, while Passepartout saves Abigail by quite literally punching another thug out the window. Eventually the gang catch up to Ambrose, but Bass steps in and decides against allowing Passepartout to shoot him in cold blood. The Frenchman relinquishes his bloodthirsty revenge, handing Ambrose back over to Bass to deal with. With the whine of a train whistle, the trio hurry up to catch their train and continue on this journey. As they set out on their way, Bernard receives a letter confirming that Fogg and Abigail are still alive and en route to New York. When Bellamy finds out, he immediately leaves the room and remains intent on finding Fogg. Fogg makes it to New York Station, and as he looks up at the grand clock, realizes this matches the same card he was given when the journey began all those episodes ago. Is this Episode 8 of Around the World in 80 Days begins this finale in New York, with Fogg, Passepartout, and Abigail all surrounded by reporters wanting to talk to them. Everyone is well aware of their antics, and as we roll round to day 70, the trio prepare for their final leg of the journey. Fogg, though, is clearly distracted. Why does Fogg head back to the station? Their destination is the Henrietta, a grand vessel bound for England. Only, Fogg soon leaves the ship before it departs, hurrying back to the clock at the station. Minutes tick by and still he waits, hoping for Estella to show. This explains why he's been so distracted all this time. And thankfully, Estella does show up. As fate would have it, Estella appears and immediately berates Fogg, slapping him for breaking her heart and leaving the woman in limbo. With Estella by his side, she talks about her ordeal. What happened to Estella? Did she send the postcard? Since leaving her in France, Estella admits that she's had a mixed life. Although she's settled down and had kids and a husband, it doesn't compare to the grand adventure she promised herself with Fogg. As she says herself, it's not remarkable, but it's at least something. When she learns Fogg has done nothing with his life, she exclaims, "I knew it," before admitting that she's the one who sent the postcard back in episode 1. The night before they were bound to leave for France, Bellamy actually approached Estella, telling her how useless Fogg was and dissuading her from leaving. Estella stood up for him, but unfortunately she was proven right when Fogg got cold feet and left. Estella promises that Bellamy will always try and hit out and knock him down. The only way to prove him wrong is to win the bet. How does Needling die? This burst of courage and confidence is enough for Fogg to reconcile his differences with Estella and rush back to the Henrietta before it departs. Passepartout and Abigail stick together, twiddling their thumbs and worrying whether Fogg will show up in time or not. En route, Fogg is stopped by Needling, who holds him up at knife point. The thing is, several other thieves watch from afar as Fogg is taken into an abandoned warehouse. A whole gang of men show and surround Needling and Fogg. Together they work to thwart the threat, with Fogg's unconventional fighting methods working well to force the gang to scarper. Unfortunately, or fortunately depending on your perspective, Needling ends up stabbed in the skirmish and bleeds out right there. This crucial bit of deus ex machina allows Fogg to make it back to the Henrietta just in time as the trio hop aboard and prepare to head back to England. Interestingly, he also holds a telegram from Bellamy, clearly stating his intent to stop Fogg no matter what. What happens in England? Why can't Fogg progress? Well, the boat makes it back to England, but there's another problem. Fogg is denied entry given there's an outstanding arrest warrant for him from Hong Kong. Fogg encourages him to send a telegram to explain this mix-up, but the worker in question doesn't arrive until 8 a.m. That would consequently mean Fogg fails, but he fails anyway when he tries to charge past the security onto the station. Unfortunately, he's arrested for his efforts. In his absence, Abigail and Passepartout make a promise to stay by each other's side. Things seem bleak, but as we reach day 81 of the journey, Fogg is free to go. Although he initially thinks he's out of time, it turns out they're actually still on day 80, a day behind given they've been traveling eastward this whole time. Does Fogg win his wager? The trio are certainly cutting it fine, but as they charge up the street, with the obligatory snowfall that comes once in a blue moon in England, Fogg makes it back with 1 second left to go on the clock. While Fogg is admired for his efforts, Bellamy calls out that the bet was never about money. Fogg stands up to the gentleman this time. With a check for £20,000 already written, Fogg hands it over to Bellamy, proclaiming loudly that he can pay off his debts and prevent being bankrupt. Bellamy silently takes the check and leaves, ridiculed and berated by everyone else in the gentlemen's club. This last act of selflessness helps to push Bellamy out of the club, while Abigail and Passepartout drink to their friendship. How does Around the World in 80 Days end? As the trio read about a strange contraption out at sea, they eventually head out into the streets together, away from the club. They finish their wager, but clearly bolder adventures await them in Season 2. Theory of last episode. Around the World in 80 Days bows out its first season with a pretty good final chapter, one that rounds out this adventure on a high, but also leaves plenty in the tank for the already greenlit second season. Some of the drama here has been a little underdeveloped and rushed, like Bellamy's debts and the romance between Abigail and Passepartout, but largely Fogg's journey comes to a decisive ending. Given a second season has been greenlit, I actually wish we'd seen more of this singular journey, with the first season split into the first 40 days and the second depicting the latter half of this journey. This could have allowed a lot more characterization and for interesting locales away from the obvious hotspots in the book to be explored. Regardless, this finale rounds out what's otherwise a solid but unremarkable adaptation. This is obviously a far cry in tone from the book, and while there's nothing that memorable to be seen in this, there's equally nothing offensively bad or terrible. David Tennant does well to command the screen, and despite how unlikable Fogg starts off this journey, he at least comes into his own later on down the line, showcasing a decent character journey. It's not perfect, but Around the World in 80 Days has been good value for its run time, although I doubt this one will be remembered for long when 2022's TV schedule starts to pick up. Around the World in 80 Days is one of those quintessential adventure stories that everyone has heard of. Even if you've never read the original tale, the journey of Phileas Fogg circumnavigating the globe in 80 days is well known. Over the years there have been a fair few adaptations that have been a mixed bag of the good, the bad and the ugly. It's fitting then that BBC's latest offering hits all three of these categories, eventually nestling itself somewhere in the realm of indifferent mediocrity. There's nothing inherently awful about this adaptation, unless you're expecting a faithful book adaptation, in which case run a mile, but likewise, there's nothing great either. The story here is generally the same as the original tale, in the sense that Phileas Fogg makes a wager and tries to travel the globe in under 80 days, but the tone here is distinctly darker and more serious, with a lot more political and social messaging to boot. Joining Fogg on his misadventures is female journalist Abigail. She documents Fogg's journey, while Fogg is accompanied by his manservant, a Frenchman by the name of Passepartout. Together, the trio travel the globe, intending to make it back to London by Christmas Eve. Only, Bellamy, one of the gentlemen from the club, tries to stop him at random points across the globe. Instead of frolicking, swashbuckling adventures and exciting tales fit for the whole family, Fogg's journeys are a mixed bag of cynical digs at Fogg's ineptitude, more on that in a minute, or episodic explorations of flawed cultural issues of the time. Adventures are in short supply here. This is a grim, gritty tale where our trio wade through treacle to get to where they need to go. The biggest problem with this adaptation, though, comes from Fogg himself. Given I read this book back when I was a kid some 25 years ago, I may be mistaken, but Phileas struck me as a confident and charismatic gentleman who used his wits to get out of situations. Here, though, Phileas Fogg is dragged through his adventure by Passepartout and Abigail. He's a bumbling, arrogant, ill-equipped man who's both insensitive and at times incredibly childish. And this is our protagonist we're supposed to be rooting for. The amount of times Abigail and Passepartout bail Fogg out of tricky situations undermines his credentials as an adventurer, especially late on when Americans gush over his achievements. It also takes way too long to warm toward Fogg, and I wouldn't be surprised if many people turn this off before they see the positive changes in his character later on. Visually, the show does look good, and there's some really nice set design and costume work here. The music is, oddly, whimsical but works surprisingly well, despite the dark tone this one takes. Plot issues aside, this is an aesthetically impressive series, and the location work is absolutely on the money. Speaking of on the money, David Tennant brings a good deal of charisma to his character, doing his best to portray Fogg's theatrical persona. Without him, this show would arguably fall flatter than it does. In the end, Around the World in 80 Days is just about good enough. It's a different interpretation of the source material, with plenty of additions and omissions to distort and twist this into something that almost resembles the book, but feels original enough to see where the journey takes Fogg and co. A few of the chapters do stand out, like episode 5 where the trio are stuck on a desert island, while other inclusions, like Bellamy's lackluster threat, feel half-baked and add nothing to the show. Around the World in 80 Days is worth checking out if you're desperate for something to watch. There's certainly some excitement to be had here, but it's also forgettable enough that, when the TV schedule picks back up, you won't really miss this.